We want to welcome everybody to the Brattleboro Literary Festival. This is our 19th year, and we have Paul Krugman and Chayes with us, two amazing authors, and we're lucky to have them speaking to us so close to the November elections. Paul Krugman is an economist who's been a New York Times columnist for the past 2 decades and teaches as the Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. In 2008, while he was the Professor of Economics and International Affairs at Princeton University, he received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his contributions to new trade theory, which included, quote, the analysis of trade patterns and location of economic activity, which is more to the point, how metropolises around the world tend to have certain characteristics in common, allowing them to grow through economies of scale, generating higher real wages, larger scale production, and more diversified supply of goods that dominate global trade. Paul's latest book, Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and the Fight for a Better Future, takes a closer look at why so many of the zombie ideas about economics, politics, and policy that emanate our public discourse, and that should be dead on arrival, keep coming back to haunt us, and how to cut through the noise. His book charitably calls these zombie ideologies that walk among us misunderstandings that just won't die, and takes us through healthcare, tax reform, social security, and housing bubbles. He even has a section at the very end on cryptocurrency for the crypto curious among you. Most importantly, he tries to help us make sense of where the United States has come from and where it's going. And he does it in concise, easy to read chapters, which is not very easy in these times. In addition, he has published more than 24 books. He was born in New York and still lives in New York City to this day. He received his PhD in 1977 from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Mass. And in addition to receiving the Nobel Prize and other awards for his work, he has been called the Mick Jagger of political economic punditry. Sarah is a journalist, historian, and prize-winning author who is one of the world's foremost anti-corruption experts. She received a master's degree in history from Harvard University and served in the Peace Corps in Morocco. As national public radio correspondent, she worked from Paris and then Afghanistan, covering the fall of the Taliban. And then she did something few journalists would ever dare do. She stayed behind to help rebuild, running a soap factory in downtown Kandahar, covering the plight of Afghans even as reigniting insurgencies took hold. Sarah's innovative and internationally renowned work draws from her time not only in Afghanistan, but also in the Balkans, Nigeria, Honduras, Uzbekistan, and Nepal, where she closely studied and wrote about how when corruption takes root, it can sow the seeds of extremism. Her book, Thieves of State, Why Corruption Threatens Global Security, won the LA Times Book Prize in 2016. She has advised the topmost levels of US military, serving as a special advisor to 2 commanders of the international forces in Kabul, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She also spent 5 years at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She now lives in Paw Paw, West Virginia. Most recently, Sarah has turned her focus to corruption here at home in the United States, and the result is her 3rd and latest book, On Corruption in America, which ahead of the 2020 election could not come at a better time. The book is a tour de force covering the history of corruption, tracing from Jesus and King Midas to America's present travails, and laying bare the legal, political, and socioeconomic forces that allow corruption to flourish. It also shows clearly how we might recognize its signs so we might do something about it. Her latest book is so powerful, The Economist earlier this month stated, quote, new book by Sarah Chayes reveals the country's descent into a level of corruption usually associated with places like Nigeria and Afghanistan. So to kick off this talk, I would like to ask both of you, Paul and Sarah, with hundreds of thousands dead from the pandemic and only days to go before this presidential election, how did America get here? What concerns you the most about our long-term and short-term future? And what can we do about it?
That's an easy one.
No, I mean,
Thank you.
Yeah, since Sarah seems to be dumbstruck for a second there. Look, I mean, we spent a long time getting here. If you think it's just Donald Trump, then you've missed the story. He's the just the symptom something that's been going on, and it is. I would say it is corruption. It's what Sarah says. Uh, in my book, I talk about zombie ideas, and the question would be, what keeps these zombies alive? So, take why do people? Why does basically every Republican in office say that cutting taxes on the rich does wonders for the economy and creates, and actually pays for itself, when there is no evidence at all supporting that, and overwhelming evidence against, overwhelming consensus of actual professional economists against it? And the answer is, well, look at who does advocate it. It's always, I was actually looking up who was producing the rosy scenarios for the Trump tax cut. And the most prominent was something called the Tax Foundation, which is a think tank, or you need scare quotes on that, think tank. And topping the list of funders is the Koch brothers. So it really is. It is. But this is. I think the question would be not, is our discourse massively corrupted, but why were we so vulnerable to that? Sarah wants to come into that.
Yeah, I mean, I looked, and believe me, On Corruption in America does not try to do a comprehensive history of corruption from the days of Midas to today. So don't be, but and actually, before I launch further in, I would like to just say a word of thanks, not only to the Brattleboro Festival and to Leah for hosting us, but also to the almost 100 people who are currently participating, at least on Zoom. It is a gorgeous day in Vermont. Not all of you are in Vermont, but you do have other stuff to do with your time. And we're really grateful that you've chosen to spend, almost an hour of your precious time with us. We hope that we won't be depressing you too much. So what I did do was look at some specific moments in history that are particularly illuminating. And Midas and Jesus have some pretty fundamental concepts to pass along, one being the compulsion to convert things of inestimable value, you could say sacred value, into, in Midas's case, gold. In fact, today, zeros in bank accounts. And the problem is, when you're afflicted with that disease, there's no finish line. It's not about having enough money to do something. It's because we're valuing people by the number of zeros in their bank accounts. And therefore, that's a race with no finish line. People sick with that disease often weave themselves into coalitions that start bending the rules to allow them to compete better with each other within a bent rules system. And that's another way of talking about corruption. And so another period that I think is really illuminating is, broadly speaking, the Gilded Age, period from about 1870 to about the late 1930s, where this was systemic corruption was the word of the day, not just in the United States, but in every industrialized country, regardless of government system. And that's what's really scary. So, Paul does spend a lot of time focusing on the differences, as I think you should, between the broad Democratic and Republican ecosystems. What scares me a little bit is when you start looking closely at these networks, they turn out to weave across a lot of the identity divides that are pitting American citizens against each other. And that includes the political divide. And so I do a little bit of network mapping just by way of example. You scratch the surface of Madeleine Albright and you come up with the head of the US Chamber of Commerce, who was a staunch and very militant Republican. You scratch the surface of Stephen Mnuchin and you get George Soros. I mean, it's pretty stunning. And so I'm not trying to do a false equivalency here, but I do think it's important to understand that in the process that got us here, which I would say starts roughly in 1980, to the contemporary pandemic of kleptocratic governance, if you will, what you see are some very radical moves that are engineered by people like the Kochs, eventually starting in the 1990s, but by the Reagan gang, and various people collected around them. But then you do see a kind of validation of a lot of the substance of what they were doing, in particular in the Clinton administration, including further deregulation of the financial sector and various other, I want to say, kind of validating actions that have made it more easy for integrated networks of government officials and mega rich private interests and some out and out criminals to reconfigure themselves and kind of hijack the American political economy.
Yeah, I mean, let me. I think part of the. I'm not sure that we have an actual difference here. I think.
I don't think so either.
There's a. I mean, I think I do end up grading on a curve, and so I say, well, okay, the modern Republican Party is entirely, entirely corrupt, if you like, entirely in bad faith. There are no incentives whatsoever to be honest about the way things work and the actual effects of policies, whereas the Democrats, being only partially corrupt, are there. And actually, in some ways, the interesting question is why that's the case. Why is it? We talk actually in the sort of policy-oriented, policy intellectual arena. We talk about the hack gap, the fact that the Republican-leaning economists will sing the praises of anything that a Republican president proposes, anything that Republicans in Congress propose, no matter how absurd. And the Democrats don't do that to the same, Democratic-leaning economists don't do that to the same extent. They seem to be more concerned with professional reputation, something like that. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly. I mean, I was, the Obama was certainly not personally corrupt, and I don't think anybody at a high level in his administration was, getting briefcases full of cash. But there was an awful lot of influence of Wall Street bankers on Obama. There was an awful lot of, and it's some people I've known for a long time. I was really disappointed to see them go to work for Citigroup and or hedge funds after they left the administration. And none of them, I'm sure, in their minds were saying, I'm tailoring my policies so as to please the people who are going to pay me a lot of money later. But there has to be some influence there. So yeah.
I mean, I was going to say that's really, I think you're putting your finger on a point that's important here. When I use the word corruption, I'm not talking about this sort of, frankly, now trivial legal definition of corruption under which you have to really be an idiot to commit the act that now legally counts as corruption. When you're talking about the activities of networks, what's so important is that the quid pro quo may be quite distant in time. It may even be, as you suggest, Paul, unconscious, like you're not deliberately, actively, consciously choosing not to, prosecute any of the big banks for the 2008 meltdown because you happen to have defended, I'm talking Holder here, because you defended them in your prior work at Covington and Burling, but it becomes a sort of almost culture, right, of the way people who are members of this network act. And again, when I say network, I'm not talking a, kind of Marvel Comics, people sitting in a room planning out the doom of the universe. I'm talking, networks of people who went to school together, who worked for each other, who did each other favors, who hired each other's children, who, whatever, and who are often rivals as well as allies, and it's a dynamic kind of system. That's what I'm talking about. But what's so interesting is I think that the vast majority of the American public understands what you and I are talking about as corruption, while simultaneously the elites, meaning the Supreme Court and members of Congress often, have been successively narrowing the legal definition of the term, often under pressure from the same folks who are producing the zombie economics. I mean, Citizens United was heavily funded by Charles Koch.
Yeah. I mean, I'm torn a little bit between saying there's a difference between, I mean, there's the pure hack stuff, which is, yeah, it generally doesn't actually, I mean, I think there may be more raw, old-fashioned, just, money handed under the table than we like to think. That it's actually, there's more of the just plain crude corruption going on than we would like to imagine is possible in this day and age, but it actually happens. But there's also, but a lot of it is the softer stuff, the revolving door, even just the social circuits, and you're right. But the on the yeah, so on the other hand, again, there are noticeable differences. So again, I really end up grading on a curve. And one of the things that's interesting, if you look at, again, things I know something about, so economics is the area I know pretty well. Well, yeah, but I mean, I know the
understatement of the century.
I don't mean the actual economic analysis, but I know the sociology of it. I know this, I know the people. I know how it functions, and it happens to be among social sciences. It's way more conservative than sociology, say, or there are a fair number of perfectly reasonable, smart, do actual research, center-right economists. What's interesting, and some of them have really prostituted themselves on behalf of Republican politicians. What's interesting is that it doesn't work. They don't actually get the plum jobs because they're not considered reliable because they have some professional standing and some so if you look at who Trump turns to, he turns to creatures like Larry Kudlow or Stephen Moore, who are considered ridiculous among people who do any actual economics, but that's exactly the point. It's not as if they could suddenly take a stand on principle and revert to being a sound economist because, and at some level, I think people like Trump know that. They know that these are people who are fully dependent on them. So then, and that's not the case. If we are going to have a Biden administration, I will worry about corporate influence, but I'm not going to worry about that kind of pure hackery.
What I love about your whole framing of things as zombie ideas, I mean, it's just putting your finger on these, provably false theories and analyses that don't die. I actually think, as you suggested in the beginning, that they've got a lot of gasoline behind them, meaning one of the things I do in On Corruption in America is to look at what are some of the tactics and counter moves that are deployed by, kleptocratic networks when they start to come under pressure, or corrupt networks, whatever you want to call it. Or I use a metaphor, which is the Greek myth of the Hydra, because the other thing about him is you chop off a head and two more sprout. And we've been seeing this around the world, and, in Guatemala and, a lot of the anti-corruption uprisings around the world, in Egypt, in even Tunisia, you could say the network rises again. Anyhow, so the number one tactic that I have seen networks around the world and obviously in the United States deploy to protect themselves is activating identity divides.
Yep.
And it is Lebanon has been a real case study in that, but we're a pretty good case study ourselves. Another one is the zombie thing, is the deliberate sowing of doubt. I mean, falsehood, obviously, or false theories, false, or it's like opening the window of what's even considered discussable in polite company. But in a lot of cases, including, sugar, tobacco, and climate, they're not even trying to anchor a contrary theory the way they did with trickle down, economics and tax cuts, but rather the objective is just confuse people enough that you can slow down or shatter the consensus behind the truth.
Yeah, we're actually seeing that in real accelerated time. I like to say these days we're living on COVID time. Things that normally take a year take a week, and you're seeing that very much. The whole pandemic policy, social distancing, masks, the finding, find somebody with something that sounds like medical credentials, even though they're usually not actually relevant, to say that we don't need to do the things we in fact need to do. And it's not really that anyone is, that I don't think that Trump and company expect to convince people that herd immunity is the answer. They just want to convey enough doubt
Exactly.
that they can get away with these destructive policies. No, that's very much.
And it's very deliberate. I mean, it's very deliberate. And
yeah.
so what I would love to know, there are investigative reporters who started really working this in a very interesting way on climate and tracing the same groups that really shattered what had been bipartisan consensus on climate back in the 1990s, completely shattered it. It's the same people who were obfuscating about tobacco. And then before that, I can't remember if they were able to draw a line all the way back to sugar, or whether the tobacco people just learned from what the sugar industry had done. I'd love to see some of the economic theories that you're pointing to. Is there also a straight line there? And you're already pointing to the Kochs on taxes, so it looks like there is.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. I was thinking about your octopus thing. So one of the zombie things I talk about, we had this in the aftermath of the last financial crisis. We had this obsession with debts, government deficits, which was actually, it turns out to have been crippling. It really impeded recovery here. It was catastrophic in a number of European countries, and there seemed to be lots and lots of think tanks and groups that were, saying, "Oh, debt is an enormous threat," and it turns out that pretty much all of those groups were Pete Peterson. Basically, it was one billionaire was providing the funding for what looked like a multiplicity of independent sources, and it didn't take a lot of scratching to find that out. And that's going to be really interesting to see whether that comes back. So all of those groups went remarkably quiet as soon as it was a Republican president running deficits, and assuming that the 12% chance, according to Nate Silver, of a Trump reelection doesn't happen. Are they? I think I'm not. It's not really a question. For sure, that stuff is going to come back and attempt to cripple the economy under Biden. But then the question is going to be, and this is actually one of these things that bears on all of these things, whether the self-proclaimed centrists will buy into it the way they did last time. I mean, it seemed to me that it was transparently obvious that this was a manufactured scare, and that it had a political purpose, which was to cripple the Obama administration. But lots and lots of people, basically most of the news media, just bought into it as if it was not even arguable. Of course, the deficit was a threat, and we're going to see whether they follow that, follow down that road again. So, but yeah, it's the combination of sowing doubt and then co-opting people who are not themselves exactly not as cynical as the people promoting the ideas, but easily snookered. That's a very potent combination.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look, there was a point. I mean, I didn't invent, but I stole the phrase. Very serious people capital VSP. So on deficits, I mean, there were, of course, there were the right wingers claiming Obama is going to bring us hyperinflation and, you know, all of that, and we're all going to turn into Greece. But by themselves, that wouldn't have had as much influence as the fact that practically the whole media establishment bought into that, and they did it because they had been convinced that it sounded serious and hard-headed to say, well, you know, yes, no, unemployed, yes, we should be worried about them, but you know, this budget deficit is a real threat to the future, and and as a number of people point out, I quote in my book, even the pretense of journalistic neutrality was dropped. Reporters would say, will Obama do the right thing and cut entitlement spending? As if, of course, that was the right thing. And not only was that, you know, it wasn't even controversial. In fact, it was clearly the wrong thing. But they got recruited into this. And the question is whether we'll see that sort of thing. I mean, whether we'll see that sort of thing happening again. In some ways, the fully corrupt people are fully corrupt. It's the people who are, in some vaguer sense, which I think you're kind of getting at, sucked into this and end up dictating political positions, public opinion. That's where you can hopefully have some impact, but it's also where the fight can be lost.
Did you ever talk, you know, as you were developing that thinking, you know, the very serious people and really seeing how the media, like, did you talk to any reporters or any, you know, of the economics journalists, just ask them why
Well,
to hear?
it wasn't the economics journalists. The people who actually do economics were never part of this. It was the sort of the political reporters. And look, I found I'm sometimes on the edges of the kind of world of, you know, comfortable relationships that you talk about, right? I've got fancy academic credentials and all of that, and write for a very mainstream paper, and so I find myself in meetings where you have economists and government officials and bankers, and you can just see that some of them, no doubt, are actually more corrupt than I would like to believe. They seem to be, you know, perfectly reasonable when I talk to them, but there's probably other stuff going on. But it's also that you can just see that something gets defined as this is what sounds. It's what all the other serious people are saying, so it must be serious. But of course, the big money has an enormous ability to shape what that is. And you try, you know, people wouldn't jeer at me when I said, hey, you know, we need to be running bigger budget deficits right now, but it was kind of a, yeah, good boy, and then went back to where they were.
You know, I think that, and I got asked by my editor, you know, look, Sarah, people feel really overwhelmed by all of this, really overwhelmed. And it seems so interpenetrated and so, you know, to have captured so many of the levers of power, and people feel really powerless. So you do a lot of counter analysis. I guess it's not really your job to tell people what they ought to be doing, like regular people, but I think people are really, like, what do you think regular people can best do to help counter some of the phenomena that we're talking about?
Well, first of all, actually, I'm actually out in New Jersey at the moment, and there are yard signs, and I'm in a pretty liberal part of New Jersey. And the best yard sign I just saw about 20 minutes ago said, person, man, woman, vote. So that's the first thing to do, right? Obviously, we still have elections where votes matter, not equally, but they do. But also, one thing I found talking to politicians is how and actually journalists, I should also say journalists, they're far more sensitive to mail, to complaints than people might imagine. They get really rattled if they start to get a lot of people writing letters, or to some extent now saying things on social media that they're saying, hey, what the hell are you doing backing this terrible policy? It's an interesting thing. I think most mainstream journalists are, let's put it this way, they've accommodated, they know that the right wing is going to generate vast quantities of hate mail if they stray, and it does affect them. They are intimidated, and then they get really rattled and sometimes angry when they get pushback from the other side. And on the one hand, what they get sometimes there's this lashing out. How dare you criticize my bona fides? But on the other hand, the fact that they get so rattled is telling you that it matters. Essentially, I of course I'm the king of hate mail. I get so much of it that in fact, if I don't get hate mail after I've written something, then I worry what I did wrong. But but a lot of journalists are really, I think, can be affected if they get some, even though they know it's a very crude signal, but if they get something that says, hey, you're giving aid and comfort to bad people, they will react. Actually,
That's
if I can
really
say,
interesting. So you're talking about reaching out directly to journalists.
yes, yeah, definitely. I'm sure some of my colleagues at the Times won't be happy to have me saying this, but send emails, comments. I've actually watched repeated times over the last just couple of months where there's a cycle where Trump or some other politician will do something that is really outrageous, and the first story on the website of the news organization will actually be kind of both sides downplaying it, making it seem even, and then there's a storm out there online of people saying, what the hell is going on here? What is wrong with you people? And within 5 or 6 hours, you can see the story change to accurately reflect what happened or what was said. And it's very clear that the pressure matters. That actually is, so it's not there. You'd be surprised actually at how much, again, I think people in positions of importance are not expecting to receive pushback from ordinary citizens. And when they do, it at least deflects their course a little bit.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, I grappled a little bit with the issue of kind of consumer boycotts. I mean, there's the whole issue with cancel culture and things like that, but I do think that a little bit of shaming over stuff like having a ridiculous amount of money that you obviously, I mean, for example, the consumer pushback against against Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
When they, committed across the bank, obviously, a massive fraud on their customers by giving them bank accounts and credit cards and all these kind of things that no one had asked for. And then there was a class action suit, and Wells Fargo was prosecuted also. Wasn't it criminally prosecuted in that case?
Yeah, I think so.
But people took their money out of Wells Fargo. And I mean, if you listen to their advertisements now, it's pretty funny. Like they're almost trying to project themselves like an NGO.
Yeah.
At this, and so.
By the way, there's something very funny happening right now. Yesterday, Senator Perdue of Georgia made fun of Kamala Harris's name in sort of pretty obviously racist fashion. And today, Purdue Chicken is all over the place on social media telling people that we have no connection with this guy. So they think it matters.
Yes, and what I've been interested to see as I've kind of looked at this, there was Me Too. There now, particularly with respect to race, it's clearly mattering.
Yeah.
What I see less of, with Wells Fargo being, I think, an exception, is the sort of slapping down of the top members of these integrated networks that are spinning around in and out of, private companies and government office and bending the rules to help, essentially a trickle up kind of thing happen in our economy and make it easier for large corporations to soil the environment and disregard labor laws and product safety and all that kind of thing. I'm not seeing the sort of social shaming reflex being applied to that gang as much.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to have an opportunity and a test actually in the next few months. Uh, there should be, first of all, election outcome is not certain, obviously, but there should be a lot of corporate entities are going to be, their first instinct will be to do the usual thing and hire a lot of outgoing members of the defeated administration for lobbying jobs, communication jobs, and they will be terrible people. They'll be people who have either legally or in practice committed major crimes, and the shaming of corporate entities to say, do not do this. You do not offer the revolving door to people who are responsible for ripping children away from their parents or destroying the environment. That's going to be a really important test to see
And
whether.
that's something we can all do,
Yeah,
and we can
exactly.
also take our money out of, Wells Fargo and put it into our neighborhood, credit union.
Yeah.
And we can, I think also start thinking about what are demands that we could, do you remember the no new taxes pledge that, again, right, you roll your eyes, but what if on our side, on the kind of integrity side,
Yeah.
we were able to come up with a pledge that's that simple? Maybe it might have 3 components or something like that, and start holding candidates to it, even across the political divide. If we could come up with something that the broad base of ordinary Americans really do agree with, I think not taking big donations for political campaigns is starting to make some headway. I don't know. I just feel like and I have an epilogue where I kind of throw the kitchen sink in there in terms of what ordinary people might be able to do, because I feel like this fight needs all of us. I really do.
Yes. Well, there's going to be a big. I mean, we really need to start thinking about these things, and in a little over 2 weeks. Then the question becomes, how do we stop the electoral outcome from being effectively undone because the corruption takes over? And that's going to be it's a real. I will see. I mean, I think it was after. We failed on that a couple of times before. I mean, there were a lot of people who really should have been excluded from, should have paid a price for what they did under Bush, and did not. And then there were, and I have to say, I think I attended conferences with people who, I would joke to my friends, well, I was able to interact with so-and-so and not bring up the war criminal thing. But the fact of the matter is that I didn't. And but this time now, we really need to. At this point, looking back is going to be essential to moving forward. If we try to write this off as just an episode and with no further significance, then we really are sunk. Then we are on our way to becoming Nigeria or Afghanistan.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the point of the Hydra.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, particularly, again, there is a focus on the guy at the top, and rightly so, and there's an election coming up. But just as you opened this whole conversation by saying, it ain't just Mr. Trump, and it's time to actually sort of look at the network and its practices. And so lopping off, one head of the Hydra is not going to be enough either to kill the beast or, really to regenerate and reimagine, to use a current word, the structures and principles that are central to this American democracy of ours. That's going to be a pretty tough task. And it's going to be, it's not going to be over in a day. And so that is, again, also what I feel like is going to take all of us and all of our different talents and inclinations and abilities.
Before we all go, because I know we're supposed to wrap up close to 4, do you both have in your minds things that you would like to see people do more of, ordinary Americans, whether they're in a place to be powerful or whether they are just simply in a place to vote, what we can do? I think a lot of people listening would like to hear any advice before we go.
Okay, well, clearly, obviously, vote. And this is, you need, if at this point, I think in a lot of ways, this election it's not so much about policy. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of policy things we want to do, but the immediate question now is, can people be corrupt in office? Pretty raw corruption? Can they violate law? Can they violate human rights and pay no political price? And you have to say to yourself, even if you think that we should not have expanded health care and you don't want to see taxes on the rich go up, you need to ask yourself, is it okay for the kinds of people who've been running the country to stay in power? And I hope that people will respond to that. But then, as I said, I think the visible public expression, both in the form of directly mailing, writing to people in power and journalists who cover people in power, has a bigger impact than people realize. And then look, the BLM, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations have been actually quite remarkable. I mean, if you actually ask, did they matter? Yes, they did. They actually seem to have led to a substantial change. Not enough, obviously. There's still, police officers who murder people not being punished for it. But it moves just seeing people out there, I think, matters. And so being active, not just sitting. We all have lives to live and want to do, but being a visible activist matters a lot more than a cynic would want you to believe.
Sarah?
I really agree. And I think, so again, I don't want to sort of say read the book, but I really worked hard to come up with as many ideas as I could at, both with respect to private sector and public sector. And so, but I do think this idea, the one thing I wish that I had expanded further, and I have to say Zephyr Teach Out, who's also recently written a book that I recommend highly called Break 'em Up, about the current kind of monopoly economy. But she makes a great point about boycotts, which is the great boycotts of the past, meaning tea, in our pre-revolutionary period, and the Montgomery bus boycott and things like that, were not the acts of disjointed individuals just choosing to boycott by themselves. They were concerted efforts in support of specific policy platforms. And so I think that's a good caveat. On the other hand, there's a lot of anti-monopoly work that we can all do as citizens by choosing not to buy our books on Amazon. It's perfectly easy to buy books from either your local indie or, one that you can find online. And the idea that, we have smaller companies that it is then possible to exercise oversight on, is again part of, given that this whole phenomenon is an interlacing public and private sector phenomenon, we can vote with our money so long as money has been declared to be speech. I don't approve of that, but let's talk with it, guys. And then there's like a whole, okay, like this is, I know we have to stop now. But I would love to have asked Paul more about the Federal Reserve and how the highway between, Wall Street and the Federal Reserve has affected what, so maybe you'll write a column on that. Paul.
Maybe we
Okay.
can do a follow-up talk on that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh boy. Okay.
Well, so vote with your words, vote with your dollars, and vote with your vote.
And your feet. Marching
And your
helps too.
feet. Yes.
And your feet.
Thank
That's
you.
exactly right.
Thank
Thank
you
you
Okay.
so much.
all for joining us for this hour or 45 minutes.
It was a real
Thanks,
pleasure.
everyone.
And please look at both of these wonderful authors' books on corruption in America and Arguing with Zombies. Thank you.